It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me say that I strongly, obviously, support the thrust of the report. I'd like to give you some thoughts on how to strengthen its message and put it in context. It's really about corporate citizenship, I believe, and it should be in the context of corporate citizenship, which is a far better way of thinking about business and society than corporate social responsibility. I believe that corporate citizenship is fusing high performance with high integrity. And what do I mean with that? By that, high performance is strong, sustained economic growth based on superior high-quality goods and services, providing durable benefits not only to shareholders but to all stakeholders, and balancing risk-taking with risk management. High integrity is the robust adherence to the spirit and letter of the formal rules. It is the adoption of ethical standards and positions beyond what the current law requires, and it is basically having employees embody the values of fairness, candor, honesty, reliability, and trustworthiness. That, I think, is the framework in which we ought to think about the question of what we should be doing about society's issues. And it comes up both in a performance context, in an ethical context, and a public policy context. And I think it's important to distinguish those three different ways we think about it. I would like to also, just for the sake of discussion, disagree a little bit about the question. I don't think it's entirely where the directors. I think even more importantly, it's where the CEOs. I'm going to come back to the role of the board. But I believe that part of the problem of the governance movement, and I've said this many times, is it's focused too much on the boards and not enough on the CEOs. The CEOs run the company. The boards, in their 8 times a year or 10 times a year that they meet, cannot get into the depth of issues that really is important. So I really think we need to, you could take the report and you could substitute the corporation where every place it says director, or you could substitute directors and CEO, and the report would read beautifully. I really think this is a fundamental question to think about because I think there are serious limitations on what the board can do. I'll come back to what I think is the right size role of the board in a second. But let me give an example of why the CEO is so important by talking about climate change at GE in the framework of citizenship that I just talked about. First of all, we had this initiative called Eco-Imagination, which is a business initiative. New technologies, new investment, that basically were going to reduce greenhouse gases, but that were going to be sold in the marketplace. It had to meet marketplace standards, and we said green is green. It was basically a business initiative. That was point one. Point two, we also had an ethical dimension of it, or a voluntary dimension of it. We agreed ourselves to cut greenhouse gases by a certain percent over a period of time, even as the company was, at least in those days, in theory, growing, and we were going to increase our energy efficiency. That was within our own 4 walls. That was voluntary action that we took. And lastly, we recognized that there had to be a public policy dimension. A lot of ethical actions are taken when the costs are tolerable or the problem is soluble. But if the costs are not tolerable, because they would be really uncompetitive, or the problem is not soluble by the corporation alone, then public policy is clearly necessary to advance a social good. So in the last year, GE has been very involved in a climate action partnership, not only with other businesses, with the utilities, with the autos, but with the environmental organizations, and basically put out in January, although it was lost in the news, a cap and trade detailed piece of legislation. So you have to operate within this framework of citizenship, in my judgment, and you have to differentiate between performance activities, which are going to achieve social goods, which must meet business standards, to ethical choices that you make that won't necessarily meet business standards but are still important for the company to do, and you can reason about ethics, and we can talk about that later, to the public policy dimensions where it's too expensive or you're unable to do it. Now lastly, about the boards. The boards are obviously critical. I think the most important thing is the right CEO spec. All these recommendations are great, but what is it that the CEO should do? The CEO has to balance 2 things. Risk-taking and risk management, we've seen an utter failure, a disaster, in fact, on that front. Second, fusing performance with integrity. We have to redefine what the spec is for the CEO. I think it's very consistent with what the report has said. We have to choose the right person. And that means we have to have management development systems inside the company that recognize that balance and that fusion, and don't just have a good commercial person or a good marketing person or a good engineer end up as the CEO. We have to compensate that person right, and again, we can come back to that, but there are ways in which you really can compensate for risk management, not just risk-taking, for the fusion of performance with integrity with real integrity criteria. And finally, you have to have the board focus on the top 10 issues. They can't focus on 500. On the top 10, risks and opportunities, and that will often be issues involving business and society, which CEOs are not trained for. But I really want to emphasize and leave you with the thought that while it's great to have the boards involved in this, it is all about who runs the company. It's the third dimension of governance. It's not just the shareholders to the company. It's not just the board to management. It's the third dimension, the CEO down to the company. And I will just end by saying that the Eco-Imagination Initiative was Jeff Immelt alone. This was not the board. This was Jeff Immelt going out and talking to customers, to stakeholders, and understanding how important this issue was. We all helped. He did it. It was his idea. That's the kind of CEO you want, because only that CEO who's touching the customers and the reality every day is going to be able to generate those kinds of initiatives, I think, that are realistic.